Sherlock Holmes, Case of the Phantom. Bride, Chapter 1. It was a sweltering July afternoon, the kind that made even the proud facades of London's townhouses seem to wilt under the sun. Holmes and I found ourselves far from the familiar streets of Baker Street, jostled amid the lively throng of passengers awaiting the noon departure at Paddington Station. We had no case to pursue that morning, at least none that I was aware of, and I had privately resolved to coax Holmes into a holiday, though I anticipated resistance. Holmes's moods were mercurial at best, and when deprived of intellectual challenge, he became listless, bordering on morose. As I adjusted my hat against the brutal glare, I turned to Holmes, who stood a few paces ahead, immobile amid the chaos. His sharp features were set in an expression I knew well, the narrowed gaze, the faint twitch of a smile at the corner of his mouth. He had seen something. "Holmes?" I prompted, but he did not answer. Instead, he moved with sudden purpose, weaving through the crowd toward the second-class platform. I hastened after him, elbowing my way past a harried porter and a group of squabbling children. There, by the edge of the platform, stood a woman in bridal white. At first, I thought her part of some festive procession, perhaps a theatrical company, en route to the countryside. Yet something in her posture, rigid, strained, struck a dissonant chord. She stood alone, untouched by the jostling masses, as if trapped behind a pane of invisible glass. Holmes approached her with the care of a naturalist encountering a rare and delicate specimen. Before he could speak, however, a commotion erupted, a shout, a scream, the screech of brakes as a train rounded the bend far too fast. The crowd surged backward in a living wave. I caught a last glimpse of the woman, the desperate flutter of lace against the dark iron rails. And then she was gone. The train thundered past, rattling the very bones of the platform. When it had clattered on toward Bristol, leaving only dust and ringing ears in its wake, there was no trace of her. Holmes was already on one knee, scanning the tracks with frantic precision. I joined him, my heart hammering. "There's no body," I said, my voice oddly thin in the heavy air. "No blood," Holmes muttered, his eyes darting like a hawk's. "No torn fabric, no sign of impact whatsoever." A gathering circle of onlookers pressed in, porters, travellers, a uniformed station-master wringing his cap in agitation. "I swear I saw her, sir," cried a matronly woman to my left. "Poor dear, she was right there, standing. And then—" She trailed off, clutching her chest. "She didn't jump," Holmes said sharply. "She fell or was pulled, but either way, physics does not permit the complete disappearance of mass." An inspector from Paddington's small police post arrived, his moustache bristling with officious concern. He demanded statements, jotted frantic notes, and cast suspicious glances at Holmes and me, as though we might somehow be responsible. "She's not under the train?" the inspector asked one of the porters, who returned pale and shaking. "No, sir. Checked front to back. Nothing there, sir. Not a thing." Holmes rose to his full height, brushing the dust from his knees. His face was grave, but his eyes burned with a fierce light I had seen only a handful of times before, usually at the inception of his most challenging cases. "We must act swiftly, Watson," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There is a ghost among the living, and I mean to give chase before she vanishes a second time." He turned on his heel and began issuing orders as though he commanded an army. "You," he barked at the station master, "lock down every exit. No one leaves without inspection." The man sputtered in protest. "A woman in white has disappeared from your platform before a dozen witnesses." Holmes snapped. "You would be wise to treat this with the utmost seriousness." Holmes grabbed my elbow and pulled me aside. She was real, Watson. Flesh and blood. That much I am certain. Yet where she has gone defies reason. "Could it have been some trick?" I asked. "A distraction, perhaps?" He shook his head. "If so, it was executed with a precision I have seldom encountered." We moved quickly, Holmes scanning the platform with hawk-like precision. He studied a discarded handkerchief, sniffed the air, even rapped his cane against the iron railings to test their integrity. Nothing presented itself. It was then that a small voice at my elbow made me start. "Doctor!" a boy in a newsboy's cap said, tugging at my sleeve. I crouched down to his level. "What is it, lad?" "I saw her," he whispered, glancing fearfully over his shoulder. "I saw her before, too, at Allerton Manor. Same dress, same sad face." Holmes knelt beside me in an instant, fixing the boy with an intense gaze. "When did you see her at Allerton Manor?" "Last night, sir. I was fetching papers for me mum. Saw her in the window, like she was waiting." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Your name, boy?" "Tommy, sir. Tommy Rudge." Holmes pressed a shilling into the lad's hand. "Good lad, go home. Tell no one what you've seen." As Tommy disappeared into the crowd, Holmes turned to me. "Allerton Manor," he murmured. "It is not 3 miles from here. An abandoned estate, if memory serves." "Holmes, you suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing, Watson. I'm observing that a woman in bridal white has disappeared before our eyes, and that a child claims to have seen her twice." He turned away from the platform, his coat flaring behind him. "Come, Watson, we have a bride to catch." Chapter 2. We hired a hansom cab without delay, the rickety vehicle jostling us through the narrow streets westward toward the outskirts of London. The afternoon heat pressed down upon the city like a suffocating hand, rendering every breath a laborious task. Yet Holmes, for once, seemed immune to discomfort. He sat forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the very picture of concentrated energy. As for myself, my mind raced with questions. How could a living woman vanish in the full view of witnesses without a single trace? Was it a trick of collective hysteria, a carefully orchestrated deceit, or, and here I inwardly balked, something that defied natural explanation? I was shaken from these grim thoughts when Holmes spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Allerton Manor," he mused, "once the pride of the Winterbourne family, Empty these 7 years after the last heir fled abroad under circumstances less than flattering. I raised an eyebrow. Disrepute? Holmes allowed a thin smile. Bankruptcy, scandal, a broken engagement, the trifecta of polite ruin. It is said the last Miss Winterbourne was to marry a colonel of some standing. The wedding never took place. The cab jolted as we turned onto a rougher road. The city slowly giving way to neglected hedgerows and sprawling fields gone wild. "Then you believe the woman we saw may be connected to this family?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that the boy's sighting was no coincidence. And when coincidences begin to pile atop one another, Watson, one must seek the thread that binds them." We fell into silence as the decaying silhouette of Allerton Manor came into view, a sprawling structure of dark stone and broken gables, its windows like dead eyes staring blindly at the road. The driver pulled up some distance away, clearly unwilling to venture closer. Holmes leapt down lightly, and I followed, my boots crunching over the gravel path. The manor was silent save for the low rasp of the wind stirring the weeds. It was a place forgotten by time. And yet, as Holmes's sharp gaze swept the grounds, I saw a sudden stiffening of his posture. "There," he said, pointing. On the main door, a massive oak slab studded with iron, hung a letter pinned by a rusted nail. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, a flash of stark white against the gloom. Holmes approached with measured steps, his gloved hand lifting the letter free. No name, no address, no writing on the front. With a flick of his wrist, Holmes opened it. And I craned my neck to see. Blank, entirely blank. The page was empty but for a faint watermark. An intricate design of 2 interlocking serpents. Holmes's lips thinned into a grim line. "Well, Watson," he murmured, "it appears we have received our invitation." Before I could inquire further, a sound from within the house made us both start. The creak of a floorboard, unmistakable in the oppressive stillness. Holmes's hand shot out, restraining me. His eyes glittered. "Someone is inside," he whispered. Together we moved, silent as cats, edging around to a side window where the glass was cracked and hanging from a warped frame. Peering in, I glimpsed a figure, tall, thin, draped in what seemed to be morning black, moving cautiously through a dust-choked corridor. Holmes wasted no time. He vaulted through the open window with a grace that belied his angular frame. I followed somewhat less elegantly, landing with a grunt that echoed louder than I intended. The figure ahead froze and then bolted. "After him, Watson!" Holmes cried. We gave chase down the narrow hall, our feet kicking up clouds of ancient dust. The figure darted through a crumbling door, down a flight of stairs, into the manor's bowels. A cellar, dark, damp, and reeking of rot. Holmes's lantern cut a thin blade of light through the gloom, revealing stone walls slick with moss, and shadows that seemed almost to breathe. We cornered the figure in a cul-de-sac, a chamber lined with broken casks and rusted tools. At last, our quarry turned to face us. It was not a man at all, but a woman. Her face was gaunt, her eyes fever-bright, and her clothes hung from her frame in tattered shrouds. She looked from Holmes to me, and then, with a strangled cry, collapsed to her knees. "Please," she gasped, "you must help her." Holmes knelt beside her, his voice gentle but firm. "Whom do you mean, madam?" "The bride," she sobbed. "The poor bride. She's trapped. He won't let her go." Holmes pressed a few vial of smelling salts to her nose, and she coughed, struggling for composure. "She tried to escape," the woman choked out. "At the station. But he caught her, dragged her back. She's still here, somewhere beneath. I tried to warn her." Her voice broke into incoherent muttering. Holmes turned to me, his expression grave. "She has been subjected to prolonged psychological trauma," he said. "But there is truth in her ravings, Watson. Of that I am certain." He stood abruptly, scanning the walls with clinical detachment. "This manor has secrets, Watson, and we have not yet found their heart. As we searched, Holmes's lantern revealed a strange detail, a seam in the stonework where none should be. A closer inspection revealed scratch marks on the floor, recent by the look of them." "A hidden door," Holmes murmured. "Ingenious." Ear pressed against the seam, and with a protesting groan, a section of the wall swung inward. Beyond lay a narrow staircase, spiralling downward into darkness. Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eye. "Shall we descend into the abyss, Watson?" Despite myself, a shiver coursed down my spine. "Let on," I said, forcing a steadiness I did not feel. The stairs wound down and down, the air growing colder with each step, until we emerged into what could only be described as a crypt, low ceilings, stone arches, and alcoves carved into the walls. In the centre of the room stood a coffin, or rather, something that resembled one. A heavy iron lid lay beside it, rusted hinges torn asunder. Inside, bound hand and foot, was the woman in white. She was unconscious but breathing shallowly. Her gown was torn, her veil crumpled like a discarded paper. Holmes bent swiftly, cutting her bonds with his penknife. As he worked, I became aware of a presence behind us, a shift in the oppressive air. I spun about, just as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, impeccably dressed in a butler's uniform, his face pale and composed. He carried a pistol. Holmes straightened slowly, placing himself between the woman and the newcomer. The man smiled coldly. "I wondered how long it would take you, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Welcome to my theatre." The pistol never wavered. Holmes's voice was calm. "You are not the master of this house." "No," the man agreed. "Merely its caretaker, until the bride is ready to serve her true purpose." There was something in his tone, a fanatic's certainty, that made my blood run cold. Holmes's gaze flickered to me for the briefest instant, and I understood. When he moved, I was to act. The butler's attention was fixed on Holmes. "You will not stop it," he said. "The ceremony has already begun." Holmes made his move, a sudden feint to the left, and I lunged forward, grappling the man's gun arm. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, but the shot went wild, embedding itself in the stone wall. Between the two of us, we wrestled the man to the ground, Holmes pinning his wrist until the weapon clattered free. Panting, I rose to my feet. Holmes knelt by the unconscious woman once more, lifting her gently. "We must go," he said, "before others come to finish what he began." As we ascended into the dying light, carrying the ghostly bride between us, I felt the manor's ancient stones press in, as if reluctant to relinquish their latest secret. And in the gathering gloom, I could not shake the feeling that we had merely peeled back the first layer of a far greater horror. Chapter 3. The sun was sinking by the time we emerged from the crypt. The sky streaked in crimson and gold like the final flare of a dying fire. Holmes flagged down our reluctant cabman, who, though wide-eyed at our grim procession, helped us load the unconscious bride into the cab without comment. Holmes gave terse instructions to drive to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. As the cab jolted into motion, I busied myself examining the young woman. Her pulse was faint but steady, and there were no immediate signs of injury, though her skin was clammy and her breathing shallow, the effects, I surmised, of prolonged deprivation and terror. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze distant. Only the tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm that brewed beneath his otherwise impassive exterior. "She will recover?" he asked after a time. His voice clipped. "With rest and care, yes," I replied. "She is resilient, stronger than she appears." Holmes inclined his head but said nothing more. It was unlike him to betray personal concern for a stranger. I sensed that this case had already lodged itself deep within his mind, and perhaps, deeper still, within his conscience, when, at last, we had delivered the poor girl to the capable hands of the hospital staff. Holmes turned to me with an energy that startled me. "Come, Watson, we have tarried too long. The night advances, and with it our quarry." We returned to Allerton Manor under the cloak of twilight. Holmes carried with him a lantern and a small leather pouch, the contents of which he did not immediately reveal. The house was silent once more, the oppressive weight of the earlier encounter lingering like a foul miasma. We made our way to the study, a room we had not yet properly examined. It was a vast, dimly lit space, dominated by an enormous fireplace, and lined with shelves whose books sagged under years of neglect. Above the mantelpiece hung a portrait, and it was this that drew Holmes's immediate attention. The painting depicted a man of about 40 years, handsome in a severe, almost predatory way. He wore mourning black, a crimson rose pinned to his lapel, and his eyes, even rendered in oil, seemed to follow one across the room. Holmes approached the portrait with an expression of deep interest. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing. At first glance, I saw nothing unusual. But as Holmes produced a magnifying glass from his pouch and guided it across the surface, I caught it. A small irregularity along the lower edge of the frame. Holmes pressed against it lightly. With a soft click, a hidden compartment sprang open behind the painting. Nestled within was a letter, yellowed, brittle, and bearing the now familiar watermark of the entwined serpents. Holmes unfolded it carefully. I read over his shoulder, Dicasher, the true heir of Winterbourne. When the appointed hour comes, she must be bound by blood and oath. Only thus shall the line be purified and restored. Should she resist, use the rite of binding as foreseen. Trust in the circle. M. We exchanged a grim look. The appointed hour, I said. This was no mere abduction, Holmes. It was a ritual. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. And the circle mentioned, I mused. A society, a cult. That, Watson, Holmes said quietly, is the question that troubles me most. He returned the letter to its hiding place and turned his attention back to the portrait. There is more here, he murmured. Carefully he detached the frame from the wall. Behind it, set into the very masonry, was a recess, a safe, its lock cunningly disguised amid the panelling. Holmes knelt before it, his hands working deftly. From his pouch he withdrew a set of slender tools, lock-picks of his own design, and in a matter of moments the safe clicked open. Inside was a velvet pouch and a bundle of documents. Holmes drew out the pouch first, upending its contents into his palm. A ring tumbled forth, gold, heavy, and bearing the Winterbourne crest. A serpent coiled around a rose. Holmes turned it over, revealing an inscription within. For eternity, E to A, E to A, I repeated. The last heir. Holmes gave a curt nod. Edward Winterbourne to Amelia Rowe, his intended bride, whose marriage never came to pass. He sifted through the documents, pulling free one after another, land deeds, letters, old photographs, until he found what he sought. A single formal invitation. A marriage announcement, never sent. Mr. Edward Winterbourne and Miss Amelia Rowe request the honour of your presence at their wedding ceremony to be held at Allerton Manor. The date, July 14th, today. Holmes's lips compressed into a thin line. They meant to complete the union today, Watson, he said. By force, if necessary. A marriage not of love, but of bloodlines and ancient oaths. A grotesque parody of honour. A hollow creak made us both stiffen. Footsteps. Somewhere above. Holmes extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness save for the faint moonlight filtering through a cracked window. We waited, breath held. The footsteps retreated. Holmes straightened, his voice a whisper. We are not alone in this house. I felt the hairs at the back of my neck rise. Holmes tucked the ring and letter into his pocket. We have what we need for now, but we must be cautious, Watson. Whoever orchestrated this is not yet finished. As we made our way back to the cab, Holmes paused at the threshold of the ruined manor. He turned, casting a long, searching look over the decaying structure. "There is a game being played here," he murmured, almost to himself, "and I fear we have yet to glimpse the true board." We departed into the night, the manor sinking behind us like a shipwreck swallowed by the sea. Yet in my heart I knew the tides of this mystery had only just begun to turn, and somewhere, unseen, I sensed the gaze of an unseen adversary, watching, waiting, for Holmes to make his next move. Chapter 4. We returned to Baker Street under the shroud of midnight, the city's gaslights flickering like wavering sentinels against the encroaching dark. I had scarcely crossed the threshold when Holmes threw aside his coat and made for his chemical table, striking a match and setting, a Bunsen flame roaring to life. From his pocket he produced the velvet pouch, the ring, and most carefully, the letter bearing the mark of the entwined serpents. "Watson," he said, "observe closely." I watched as Holmes held the letter above the flame, rotating it just near enough to the heat that the paper began to colour but not ignite. At first there was nothing. Then, faint, spectral, words began to bloom across the page. The bloodline must be preserved. The circle watches. The heir must be reclaimed before the new moon. Holmes withdrew the letter before the heat could destroy it. His eyes glittered. "There," he said, tapping the parchment. "The true message, written in invisible ink. Lemon juice, by the look and scent of it. Childishly simple, but effective against the unobservant." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "The new moon," I said. "That is tomorrow night." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Our adversaries are not working alone, Watson. They are but agents of a greater body, a circle that views the winter-born lineage as sacred, a relic to be preserved at any cost." He leaned back, his gaze distant. "And they will not forgive interruption." A sharp rap at the door interrupted further speculation. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "A letter, Mr. Holmes," she said, her hands trembling. "Delivered by a boy. No return address." Holmes took it without comment. As soon as Mrs. Hudson withdrew, he slit the envelope open with a scalpel-like motion. Inside was a single sheet of paper, upon which was printed in neat mechanical type, "Withdraw, or face the consequences. She is beyond saving. The circle does not break." Holmes let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. "Direct, if unimaginative," he said, "but instructive, Watson. They know we have meddled." I felt an involuntary shudder. It was one thing to pursue criminals of flesh and blood, quite another to find oneself entangled with an unseen order, bound by ritual and fanatical loyalty. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated. They are growing desperate, and desperation breeds mistakes. He rose suddenly and fetched from a drawer an envelope, the marriage invitation we had retrieved from the manor. "There is one lead we have not yet pursued," he said. "The printer." I frowned. "You believe the invitations were custom-ordered?" "No such stationery would have been available over the counter," Holmes said. "A unique typeface, a specific parchment weight, all chosen with care. If we find the printer, We may yet find the hand that commissioned them." It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when we set out once more into the night, braving the tangled alleys of Clerkenwell, where the last of London's printmakers plied their ancient trade. The fog had begun to roll in thick and low, muffling footsteps and swallowing gaslight into puddles of wan light. The city felt abandoned, haunted. At last we found ourselves before a small, grimy shop front, Lachlan and Sons, printers. Holmes rapped sharply on the door. After a long pause, the bolt scraped back, and a stooped man in an ink-stained apron peered out, blinking owlishly. "We are closed." Holmes produced the marriage invitation and held it up. "Your work?" The man squinted. His face changed. I've never," he began. Holmes stepped forward, fixing him with a gaze that seemed to pin him to the spot. "You printed this," Holmes said coldly. "There is a mark, a microscopic imperfection in the letter W. Unique to your worn type. I can trace it in a court of law, if need be." The man sagged, defeated. "I had no choice," he muttered. "It was paid in full. No names, no addresses, just the commission and a warning." Holmes's voice was like a scalpel, slicing cleanly. "What warning?" "That if I spoke of it, I'd vanish like the rest." "Who delivered it?" The man hesitated, then, "A woman. Fine clothes, gloves to the elbow, veiled." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Not the butler, then. Someone higher, someone orchestrating this charade with care. Did she say anything? Holmes pressed. The printer shook his head. Only this: "The circle endures as it ever has." Holmes nodded once, sharply, and turned away. As we made our way back through the mist-wreathed streets, my mind churned with unease. "This woman," I said, "must be the true force behind these events." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "The butler we encountered was but a foot soldier. The hand that moves the pieces remains hidden." "And the bride? The Winterbourne girl?" Holmes's face was grim. "She was meant as a sacrifice, Watson, a binding of blood to tradition. A symbol, not a soul in their eyes." The fog thickened until even the gas lamps seemed like distant stars glimpsed through heavy cloud. Holmes halted suddenly. Across the street, half shrouded by mist, a figure stood, tall, motionless, watching. Holmes stepped forward. The figure retreated into the swirling grey. We pursued, but by the time we reached the spot, it was empty. Holmes scanned the ground with his lantern. There, faint in the soot and mud, a footprint. Delicate, narrow, unmistakably female. And beside it, another, heavier, broader, a man's. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, "our adversary is not alone." I bent closer. Something glinted faintly in the gutter. A locket. Holmes retrieved it with gloved fingers, opening it with care. Inside, on one side, was the image of the man from the morning portrait, Edward Winterbourne. On the other side, a photograph of the woman we had rescued. "Good God," I whispered. "She's his daughter!" Holmes closed the locket slowly, his face darkening. "The circle is not preserving a bloodline," he said. "They are purifying it." A clock somewhere struck 2, each chime a hammer blow against the silence. Holmes tucked the locket into his coat. "Come, Watson," he said. "The real battle begins now, and I fear we are already steps behind." We made our way back toward Baker Street, the city slumbering around us, but for the hidden eyes that watched from every shadow. And as I glanced at Holmes, his profile sharp against the mist, I saw in him not merely a detective at work, but a man who had glimpsed the edge of something vast, cold, and implacable. Something that, for the first time, might not be solved with logic alone. Chapter 5. By the time we reached Baker Street, a grim determination had settled over Holmes, hardening his features into a mask of icy resolve. I had seen him in many moods, animated with triumph, dulled by ennui, aflame with intellectual excitement. But rarely had I seen him like this, silent, methodical, burdened by the magnitude of unseen forces moving against us. He threw off his coat and, without pausing, began pacing before the fire, hands clasped behind his back. "The locket is our key," he muttered, more to himself than to me. 2 photographs. Edward Winterbourne, whose disgrace toppled a house, and the child he abandoned to fate. I sank into my chair, exhaustion tugging at my limbs, but unable to overcome the tight coil of suspense in my chest. "You believe the woman we rescued is his daughter?" I asked. Holmes nodded sharply. "There can be no doubt. The physical resemblance is strong, but more than that, the obsession with bloodlines, the timing of the ritual, it points not merely to a random victim, but a designed succession." He paused before the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames. "The circle must see her as a vessel, Watson, a vessel to continue their ancient line, not by choice, not by love, but by decree." A heavy silence settled between us. The magnitude of the cruelty chilled me to the bone. Holmes turned suddenly, the light catching the glint in his eye. "But we have a name now, a thread to tug." He crossed to his desk and spread out the documents retrieved from Allerton Manor, his fingers moving swiftly among them. "There," he said, tapping one with satisfaction. It was an old lease agreement, transferring ownership of certain properties from the Winterbourne estate to a name I did not recognize. Lady Evangeline Marchmont. Holmes saw my puzzlement and smiled grimly. "She is no stranger to London's darker circles, wealthy, reclusive, and rumoured to be a patroness of unconventional societies." I leaned forward. "Then it was she who orchestrated this madness." Holmes's fingers drummed the tabletop. "Let us say, Watson, that if the circle has a priestess, it is she." He rose abruptly. "We must confront her tonight." I blinked. "Tonight? Holmes, surely!" "There is no time," he said curtly. "The new moon is tomorrow. They will not delay." There was no arguing when Holmes's mind was set. We armed ourselves discreetly. Holmes with his slender revolver, I with my old service pistol. and set off once more into the enveloping fog. Lady Marchmont's residence was a grand house in Belgravia, its windows shuttered, its grounds overgrown, the sort of place one might expect to find a fallen dynasty clinging to the vestiges of pride. Holmes picked the lock on the wrought-iron gate with ease, and we moved up the gravel path, boots crunching softly. At the front door, he paused, listening. From within came the faint strains of music. A piano played with slow, deliberate melancholy. Holmes pressed his finger to his lips and nodded. He tried the handle. Locked. Producing his tools once more, he worked swiftly, and within moments the door swung open on silent hinges. The house smelled of old perfume and dust. The music floated down from an upper floor. We climbed the staircase, each step a creaking protest against our intrusion. At the end of a long corridor stood a pair of double doors slightly ajar. Light spilled out, casting grotesque shadows along the walls. Holmes motioned for me to remain behind him. He pushed the door open. Inside, seated at a gleaming black piano, was a woman, her back to us, her hair pinned beneath a heavy black veil. She did not turn as we entered. She merely continued to play, the melody low and hypnotic. "Lady Marchmont," Holmes said quietly. The music stopped. The woman rose with slow, deliberate grace and turned to face us. Beneath the veil, I glimpsed a pale, fine-boned face, ageless and terrible in its stillness. "You are late, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and musical. "The rite is already begun." Holmes stepped forward, utterly without fear. "You seek to chain the living to the dead," he said coldly, "to bind a soul to your crumbling order." She laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill racing up my spine. "You mistake preservation for cruelty," she said. "Without the circle, there is nothing but decay." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And what of the girl's will? Her life?" Lady Marchmont tilted her head, as if considering a strange and foolish question. "Will is irrelevant. Blood remembers. Blood obeys." Holmes drew out the locket and held it aloft. "This is your symbol, is it not?" he said. "The past clutched in golden chains." Something flickered across her veiled face, something very like fury. Without warning, she clapped her hands sharply. Footsteps thundered from the corridors beyond. Holmes acted at once. He flung the locket into the fire. Effect was immediate. Lady Marchmont let out a cry, a wordless wail of rage and despair, and stumbled backward. The footsteps faltered. Holmes seized my arm. "Now, Watson!" We bolted, racing down the stairs as the house erupted into chaos behind us. We barely reached the gate before figures burst from the house, robed men and women, their faces hidden behind silver masks. Holmes fired once into the air. The figures halted, not out of fear, but confusion. They were leaderless now. The destruction of the locket, their sacred token, had broken the spell. We did not linger. We fled into the fog, the house receding behind us like a bad dream. Only once we were safely away did Holmes slow, breathing hard. He looked at me, his face grave. "The circle is not dead," he said, "only wounded." I shivered, though the night was warm. "They will retreat," Holmes continued. "Regroup. Find another heir, another pawn." I stared at him, the enormity of it sinking in. "Then we have not won," I said bitterly. Holmes smiled, a thin, sad smile. "Victory, Watson? No, merely delay." He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the fog swallowed the stars. "In the end," he said softly, "the past always comes calling." And with that chilling pronouncement, we turned toward home, the mist closing behind us like the pages of a book that would, one day, open again. Chapter 6. Morning had broken over London in a muted wash of grey, the rising sun doing little to lift the fog that clung stubbornly to the streets. I nursed a cup of strong coffee at our sitting-room table, trying to shake the chill that the night's events had left in my bones. Holmes, as ever, appeared immune to fatigue. He moved restlessly about the room, his sharp gaze darting from newspaper to telegram to the notes he had scrawled across half a dozen pages. "Lady Marchmont will go to ground," he said finally, tossing down a paper with a snap. "Her defeat last night, though partial, will force her hand." I set down my cup. "You believe she will strike again?" "I believe," Holmes said grimly, "that the circle cannot afford to let their secrets die with her." He moved to the window, peering out into the grey, watching the waking city with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. "And," he continued, "they will attempt to recover the girl. She remains their link to legitimacy, the bloodline they so fanatically seek to preserve." I shuddered at the thought. But surely, after last night, they know we are watching. Holmes smiled thinly. "Desperation makes men reckless, Watson, and it makes women ingenious." At that moment Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a small package, wrapped plainly in brown paper. "No sender," she said nervously. "It was left on the doorstep just now." Holmes took it with care, examining the wrapping with a jeweller's precision. Then, using a slender knife, he slit it open. Inside was a small box. Within the box, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single white rose, and beneath it a note. Holmes read it aloud. "The bloodline burns, yet from the ashes we will rise. Midnight, Charing Cross. Come alone, or the bride dies." I was on my feet at once. "It is a trap." Holmes smiled grimly. "Undoubtedly. And yet, Watson, it is a trap we must spring, for she is still in danger." Stared at him. But why risk it? Surely the authorities would arrive in uniform, with noise and delay. Holmes said sharply, "We have but one chance, to end this, and to end it cleanly." He glanced at the clock. "We have until midnight, time enough to make preparations." The hours passed in a tense flurry of activity. Holmes disappeared for a time into the streets, returning only at twilight, mud-stained and tight-lipped. He revealed nothing of his plans, merely instructing me to arm myself discreetly and dress in the plainest, darkest clothes I possessed. "Tonight, Watson," he said, we gamble everything. And so it was that, as the clock struck 11, we set out once more into the sleeping city. Charing Cross was nearly deserted at that hour, save for a few lingering cabmen and the occasional drunkard staggering home. The great iron arches of the station loomed overhead, black against the starless sky. Holmes moved with the fluidity of a predator, weaving through the shadows, eyes ever alert. We found her waiting by the clock tower. Lady Marchmont, her veil intact, her posture as regal as ever. Beside her stood two masked figures, tall, silent, their faces hidden behind identical silver masks, and between them the girl. The phantom bride, pale and trembling, her hands bound once more. Holmes stepped forward alone. "Release her," he said. "You have lost." Lady Marchmont laughed. A low, chilling sound. "Lost?" she whispered. "No, Mr. Holmes, we have merely adapted." At a gesture, one of the masked figures produced a vial, a dark, viscous liquid, and held it against the girl's throat. "One word," Lady Marchmont said sweetly, "and she drinks." Holmes raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I have come alone," he said, "as you demanded." She tilted her head. "Good. Then kneel." For the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Holmes's face, the natural resistance of a man unaccustomed to submission. But he knelt. Lady Marchmont approached, lifting his chin with a gloved finger. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes," she said, "but cleverness is no match for destiny." Behind her, the masked figures shifted, tightening their grip on the girl, and in that moment, so subtle I almost missed it, Holmes's hand moved. From beneath his coat he withdrew a small device, a whistle, silver and gleaming. He blew sharply. At once, from every shadow, figures surged forth. Plainclothes officers, armed and ready, swarming the station with military precision. The circle had walked into an ambush. Lady Marchmont recoiled, fury twisting her features. The masked figures dropped the girl and reached for weapons, but it was too late. Scotland Yard overwhelmed them in seconds, wresting them to the ground. Holmes rose to his feet, dusting off his knees with cold composure. "You overplayed your hand, Lady Marchmont," he said. "Desperation breeds mistakes, as I predicted." She was seized by two officers, her veiled head bowed, but her voice, when it came, was triumphant. "You think you have won," she hissed. "You have only delayed the inevitable." Holmes studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but for tonight London sleeps safe." Back at Baker Street, the girl slept peacefully for the first time in days. A constable stationed outside the door. Holmes and I sat in companionable silence, the events of the night heavy upon us. At length I spoke. "Do you believe it is truly over?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring into the embers of the fire. Then he said so softly, I barely caught it, "No, Watson, evil does not die. It only changes its mask." He leaned back, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, casting half of it into shadow. "The circle endures," he said, "and somewhere, Even now, the next move is being prepared. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the gnawing certainty that this victory was a thin, fragile thing. Holmes smiled faintly. That strange, sad smile I would come to associate with his darkest cases. "Rest, Watson," he said. "Tonight we have thrown a stone into the river, but the current flows on." And as the fire dwindled to ash, I found myself staring into the darkness beyond the window, wondering what other hidden battles awaited us, and whether in the end even Sherlock Holmes could win them all. Chapter 7. The following morning brought no sense of closure. If anything, the air around Baker Street felt heavier, as if some unseen hand had drawn the curtains tighter against the encroaching day. Holmes was up early, a thin, wiry silhouette against the window, smoking furiously and lost in thought. I watched him in silence for some time before speaking. "You fear it is not yet over." Holmes gave a humourless chuckle. "Fear, Watson, is too small a word. I know it is not over." He turned, the smouldering end of his cigarette casting his features into sharper relief. Lady Marchmont was a priestess, yes, but she was no architect. She merely carried out a design older and more complex than even she understood. "And the mastermind?" Holmes tapped a finger lightly against his temple. "Still at large? Still watching?" Before I could reply, there came a knock. Soft, hesitant. It was Mrs. Hudson, looking more agitated than I had ever seen her. "There's a man, sir," she said, wringing her hands. "Says he must see you. Says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes frowned. "Show him up." Moments later, a figure entered. A gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a limp and the air of someone who had not slept for a week. His clothes were expensive but carelessly worn, as if he had thrown them on without thought. He introduced himself in a cracked whisper. "Sebastian Winterbourne." Holmes and I exchanged a quick glance. The name needed no explanation. "You are Edward Winterbourne's brother," Holmes said. Sebastian nodded, sinking into the chair opposite Holmes with a shudder. "I know why you're looking into my family," he said, "but you're too late. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Enlighten us." Sebastian leaned forward, his hands trembling. "The circle was never about blood. That was the lie they told the outer members, the initiates. It was never about preserving a family line. It was about power." He raked a hand through his hair. "They need someone with the bloodline, yes, but only because it anchors the ceremony. The real goal is possession." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Possession?" I echoed. He nodded feverishly. "They call it the awakening. They believe that by binding the last heir in a blood ceremony, they can summon something. Something that once ruled over the Winterbournes in ages past." Holmes remained silent, his face unreadable. Sebastian's voice dropped to a whisper. "I was meant to be the vessel, but I ran. I fled to India, to America, anywhere they couldn't reach me. They turned to Amelia after I disappeared. They see her as purer. And now? Holmes asked softly. Sebastian looked up, his eyes wide and haunted. They will not stop. Even if Marchmont is gone, there are others, higher even than she was. He fumbled in his coat and produced a crumpled envelope, thrusting it at Holmes. I found this among my father's papers before I fled. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a list of names. 12, maybe more. Aristocrats, politicians, scholars, and, scrawled at the bottom, in a different hand, when the blood fails, the mind shall serve. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Sebastian rose unsteadily. I shouldn't have come, he said. They'll know. They'll come for me. Holmes rose as well, placing a hand briefly on the man's shoulder. You did the right thing, he said. Sebastian gave a broken laugh. We'll see about that. He turned and fled down the stairs. I moved to the window in time to see him disappear into the mist, his figure swallowed by the city. Holmes remained motionless for a long while, staring at the list. At length he spoke. Sebastian Winterbourne may not survive the week. I turned from the window, heart heavy. And Amelia? I asked. She is still in danger. Holmes nodded. More than ever. He tossed the list onto the table, the names glaring up at us like silent accusations. The circle does not break, he said quietly. It simply sheds its skin. He moved to the map of London pinned to the wall and jabbed his finger at a location. The final ceremony. It will be attempted again, but not at Allerton Manor, nor at Charing Cross. Where then? Holmes's voice was grim. St. Dunstan's crypt, beneath the old city. I stared at him. But it was sealed years ago, after the fire. Sealed, Holmes said, but not abandoned. Turned to me, his eyes alight with a terrible certainty. Tonight, Watson, we descend into the grave of London itself. The descent into St. Dunstan's crypt was like stepping into another world. A world forgotten by light and law alike. Holmes and I moved with utmost care, our lanterns casting long, wavering shadows along the damp stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of mould and centuries-old dust. As we rounded a corner, voices drifted toward us, low, chanting in a tongue I did not recognize. Holmes motioned for silence, and we crept forward. Through a break in the stonework, we saw them. A circle of robed figures, perhaps 24, standing around a crude altar, and bound upon that altar, Amelia Winterbourne, her face pale but defiant. At the head of the gathering stood a man, tall, hooded, his hands raised in invocation. Holmes's grip tightened on my arm. That, he whispered, is the true master. The chanting rose to a fever pitch. Holmes acted. With a shout, he hurled a gas canister into the midst of the circle. It exploded in a billow of choking smoke, sending the cultists reeling. Holmes leapt forward, cutting Amelia's bonds with swift precision. I covered him, my revolver raised against the half-blinded figures. In the chaos, the hooded master turned, and for a single, frozen moment I met his eyes. They were utterly devoid of humanity, and then he was gone, slipping into the smoke, vanishing into the labyrinthine crypt. Holmes bundled Amelia into my arms. "Hick! Go!" he shouted. "Get her out! But you, I'll follow." I obeyed, half carrying the girl through the choking gloom, up into the night. When Holmes rejoined us minutes later, he was bruised and breathing hard. "The master escaped," he said, "but his congregation lies broken." Back at Baker Street, as Amelia slept under Mrs. Hudson's care, Holmes and I sat once more by the dying fire. "Will he return?" I asked. Holmes's gaze was distant. "Undoubtedly. The circle is deeper, older, and more patient than we can imagine." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the list of names Sebastian had given him. One by one, he fed them into the fire. I watched the flames consume them. Holmes's voice was very quiet. "There are some victories, Watson," he said, "that are best left uncelebrated." He rose, silhouetted against the hearth. "And some evils," he murmured, "that no man can ever truly defeat." The fire hissed and cracked, devouring the last of the list, as outside the fog closed in once more, and the watchers in the dark, whoever they were, waited for their time to rise again. Chapter 8. The days following our descent into St. Dunstan's crypt passed in a strained, uneasy quiet. At Baker Street, Amelia Winterbourne remained under our watchful care, though she spoke little and often startled at the slightest noise. Holmes did not press her for details. He understood, perhaps better than I, that some horrors cannot be neatly exorcised with words. Yet even as the house remained still, I could feel Holmes's mind working furiously beneath the surface, a river hidden beneath ice. It was on the third morning, as I sat reviewing my notes by the fire, that he spoke. "You are chasing a ghost, Watson." I looked up from my writing. "The master?" Holmes nodded, his fingers steepled. "We know Lady Marchmont's name. We know the circle's rank and file, but the true architect, the man we glimpsed beneath the crypt, remains utterly without trace." I frowned. Could Sebastian Winterbourne not help? Surely he knows more. Holmes shook his head. Sebastian fled to preserve himself. Fear clouds memory, Watson, and the circle is meticulous. They leave no signature. He rose abruptly and crossed to the desk where he had laid out the few artifacts recovered from the crypt. A broken mask, a scorched piece of parchment, and a single ring, heavy, gold, embossed with the image of a closed eye. Holmes held the ring up to the light, his gaze narrowing. "You see, Watson, the circle's greatest weapon is not secrecy alone. It is the erasure of identity. Their master could walk among us, and we would never know him." I felt a chill settle in my gut. "You believe he moves openly?" Holmes smiled grimly. "I believe he already has." Before I could press him further, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, flustered. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took the missive, tearing it open with a swift motion. As he read, his face darkened. "What is it?" I asked. He handed it to me silently. "Sebastian Winterbourne found dead. Apparent suicide. Police unconvinced. Body at Bart's." I felt a wave of nausea. Holmes turned away, his voice low. "They are tying off loose ends." Without another word, he snatched up his coat, and we were off. Down the stairs, into a cab, and thundering through the misty streets towards St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The morgue was cold, sterile, its stone walls leaching the warmth from the air. We were led to a slab where Sebastian Winterbourne's body lay covered by a white sheet. Holmes peeled it back with a grim efficiency. There was no doubt. The man we had met just days ago now stared sightlessly into the void. His face, twisted in a final frozen rictus. The attendant, a stooped man with rheumy eyes, cleared his throat. "No signs of struggle, sir. No external injuries, but—" He hesitated. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "But what?" The man shuffled uncomfortably. There were traces of an unusual substance under his fingernails, some kind of resin or wax. Holmes's face grew intent. "Watson, observe the lips." I bent closer. There was a faint discoloration, a darkened line just at the edge of the mouth. "Poison?" I ventured. Holmes nodded. "A rare variant, likely administered through inhalation. Perhaps a candle or incense stick laced with toxins. A painless death, inducing hallucinations first." I looked at Holmes, horror rising. They made him take his own life. Holmes straightened, his jaw tightening. "No, Watson. They made him believe he had no other choice." He turned to the attendant. "I must see any belongings recovered from the body." Moments later, we were shown a small bundle. A watch, a few coins, a tattered notebook. Holmes flipped through the notebook swiftly, his brow furrowing. At the very back, on the final page, something was scrawled in a shaky hand. "The eye watches. The name is no name. Beware the mark." Holmes closed the book slowly, his fingers tapping a soft rhythm against the cover. "It is as I feared," he murmured. We left the morgue in silence, the mist curling thick around us. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his desk, the notebook open before him, lost in thought. I paced restlessly. What did he mean, Holmes? "The name is no name?" Holmes looked up, his eyes gleaming. He meant that our adversary uses no single identity. He shifts, changes names, professions, even allegiances. He is a master of masks. And the eye? Holmes tapped the ring he had taken from the crypt. The closed eye. It is their symbol, the mark of the circle's inner council. Only the highest are branded with it. I felt the net of the mystery tightening, the cold fingers of dread brushing my spine. Then how do we find him? Holmes smiled thinly. "We bait him?" I blinked. "Bait him!" Holmes rose, reaching for his coat once more. "The Circle cannot afford witnesses, Watson, and Amelia Winterbourne is the last living heir to their secret. He turned to me, his expression hard. Tonight we make it known, through every whispering alley and darkened corner, that Amelia will speak, that she will name those responsible, that she will destroy what remains of the circle. I swallowed. You intend to draw him out? Exactly. And if he comes? Holmes's smile did not reach his eyes. Then we shall be waiting. That night, word spread like wildfire through the underworld. Holmes's carefully placed messages found their mark. By midnight, Baker Street was a fortress. Plainclothes detectives hidden in doorways, watchers stationed along the rooftops. Inside, Holmes, Amelia, and I waited. The girl sat by the fire, pale but composed, clutching a small dagger Holmes had pressed into her hand with quiet insistence. Holmes sat opposite, motionless but coiled like a spring. The clock struck 1. And then a soft knock at the back door. Holmes's eyes flickered. He rose silently, motioning for me to circle around. I moved through the kitchen, my revolver drawn, heart hammering. The door creaked open. Standing there, not masked, not robed, was a man, middle-aged, nondescript, a face one would pass in the street and never notice, except for the ring on his finger, the ring of the closed eye. He smiled. You made it too easy, Mr. Holmes. Holmes stepped into view behind him, pistol levelled. Drop it. The man did not move. He simply smiled wider. You think you have won. You have broken nothing. Holmes's voice was cold as steel. You underestimate the power of light, sir. It exposes even the deepest rot. The man's smile faltered, and then, in a blur of movement, he lunged, pulling a blade from his sleeve. There was a gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space. The man fell heavily to the floor, clutching his side. He laughed, blood bubbling on his lips. You have killed a pawn, detective, he whispered. The true masters are already moving. And with that, he died. Holmes knelt beside him, checking for signs of life, and finding none. He rose slowly, holstering his pistol. I looked at him, heart pounding. Is it over? Holmes shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. No, Watson, he said softly. Tonight we have only scratched the surface. He turned away, his coat swirling like a dark banner. And the deeper one digs into the earth, he murmured, the closer one comes to waking what sleeps beneath. I stood there, the fire crackling behind me, watching as Holmes disappeared into the night, a lone sentinel against a darkness far older and far more patient than either of us had dared to imagine. Chapter 9. Morning came reluctantly to Baker Street, draping the house in a sullen grey light that did little to dispel the shadows lingering from the night before. The body of the nameless agent had been quietly removed by the yard, yet the air still seemed tainted by his dying words. The true masters are already moving. Holmes had slept not at all. I found him at his desk, hunched over a fresh array of notes, maps, and correspondences. A half-empty teapot stood forgotten at his elbow. He did not look up as I entered. "They are clever, Watson," he said. "Infinitely clever." I approached cautiously, peering over his shoulder. "What have you discovered?" Holmes tapped a sheaf of documents. "Patterns, my dear fellow. Always patterns. Even a faceless enemy leaves footprints if one knows where to look." He spread out 3 letters, all retrieved from the belongings of the dead agent. Each was written in an odd, cramped hand. Instructions, no doubt, though written in vague, almost ritualistic language. But it was not the content that caught Holmes's attention. It was the ink. "Observe," Holmes said, sliding a glass lens across the parchment. "This ink bears an unusual pigment. A mixture of gall, soot, and something else, something that stains deeper than ordinary writing fluids." I looked closer. The letters shimmered slightly under the lens, as if oil floated atop the surface. Holmes smiled grimly at my reaction. "It is a chemical signature," he said. "A mark invisible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to those who know." Stared at him. "You can trace it?" He nodded. "There are but 3 ink makers in London capable of producing this formulation. One is in Whitechapel, a minor artisan. Another in Bloomsbury, recently deceased. He tapped the 3rd location on the map. And the 3rd, Watson, lies just beyond the Strand. Mortlake and Sons, suppliers to the more esoteric clientele of London." He rose, sweeping his coat from the peg with sudden energy. "We pay them a visit. Mortlake and Sons occupied a nondescript storefront tucked between a tobacconist and a pawnshop, a place one might easily pass without a second glance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink, parchment, and something older, something faintly metallic. An elderly man appeared from behind a curtain, his spectacles thick as coins. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he croaked. Holmes produced the stained letter. "I seek the origin of this ink." The man took the paper delicately between gloved fingers, his milky eyes scanning the text. At once his face changed, a subtle tightening of the mouth, a minute hesitation. "Cannot say," he muttered. Holmes's voice was mild. "And yet, Mr. Mortlake, the composition is yours, unique to your establishment. Shall we summon an officer of the yard to clarify matters?" The old man's hands trembled. "No need, sir," he said hurriedly. "But I beg you, tread carefully. Those who commission such inks are not men to be trifled with." Holmes inclined his head. "I tread only where necessity demands." Mortlake sighed heavily and produced a battered ledger from beneath the counter. Flipping through the pages, he stopped at an entry marked by a black ribbon. Holmes and I leaned closer. There, in careful script, was the name Mr. Werner. No address, no particulars, only the instruction: "Deliver to the Crescent, Limehouse." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Werner," he repeated softly. I frowned. "The name means something to you." He pocketed the information and turned to leave. "In time, Watson, in time. We found the Crescent by late afternoon. A decaying row of buildings near the Limehouse docks, shrouded in smoke and the tang of salt water. Holmes and I moved with utmost care, our footsteps muffled against the slick cobblestones. The address given was a crumbling townhouse, its windows boarded, its door hanging askew. Holmes paused, surveying the structure. "He is inside," he said simply. I drew my revolver instinctively. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not yet, Watson. Not with force. With patience." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small vial. "Liquid smoke," he explained. "A trick I learned abroad. It will drive him into the open." He uncorked the vial and tossed it through a broken window. Within moments, a greyish haze began to curl from the cracks in the boards. We crouched in the alley opposite, waiting. Last, movement. A figure emerged, coughing, silhouetted against the thickening smoke. Holmes tensed beside me. It was not the master. It was a boy, no more than 14, thin, ragged, his face smeared with soot. Holmes approached swiftly, kneeling before him. The boy flinched, but made no move to flee. "Who sent you?" Holmes asked, his voice low. The boy shook his head violently. Holmes pressed a coin into his hand. "Who, lad?" The boy swallowed, his eyes darting. "They call him the Pale Man," he whispered. Holmes stiffened. "The Pale Man?" The boy nodded. "He moves at night, never speaks above a whisper. He leaves letters under the door." Holmes's face was grim. "And where does he go?" The boy hesitated, then pointed. "River," he said. "Always the river." Holmes rose slowly. "Come, Watson." Our quarry slips further from our grasp. We left the crescent behind, the boy vanishing into the mist. That night, we stood on the embankment, watching the black waters of the Thames coil and slither under the sickly moonlight. Holmes scanned the shadows, every muscle taut. Suddenly, he pointed. There, a figure gliding along the river's edge, little more than a darker shape against the night. Holmes moved, silent as death. We followed the figure to a narrow dock, where a boat waited, a flat-bottomed craft designed for stealth rather than speed. The figure paused, as if sensing pursuit. Holmes stepped forward into the lamplight. The figure turned, and, for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, I saw his face, pale as bone, eyes like pits, a mouth twisted in a mocking smile. Then, a flash of steel, a blade drawn. Holmes was faster. With a well-placed shot, he shattered the lantern, plunging the dock into darkness. By the time we reached the boat, it was adrift, empty save for a single item left behind. A letter. Holmes snatched it up, unfolding it beneath the faint gleam of the rising moon. It bore only 4 words. "The bloodline has spoken." Holmes closed the letter slowly. "The circle has chosen a new path, Watson. A darker one." I stared at him. What does it mean? Holmes's face was unreadable. "It means, my dear friend, that the heir is no longer merely a prize to be, won." He glanced back at the city, where the mist swallowed all sight. She is now a weapon to be unleashed. Chapter 10. We returned to Baker Street beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. The first distant grumble of thunder rolling across the city like a warning. Holmes, uncharacteristically grim, said little during the journey, yet I could feel the relentless churn of his thoughts in the tense set of his shoulders, the twitch of his long fingers against the cab's worn leather seat. Inside the sitting room, Amelia Winterbourne waited, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She rose as we entered, clutching the back of her chair as if for balance. Holmes approached her with a gentleness I had seldom seen in him. "Miss Winterbourne," he said softly, "there is something you must understand, and I fear it will not be easy." Amelia straightened, drawing strength from some private reserve of will. "Tell me," she said. Holmes glanced at me briefly, then began. "The Circle sought you for your bloodline, yes, but not merely to preserve it, to corrupt it, to use you as a vessel for a far older ambition." Amelia's mouth tightened, but she did not flinch. Holmes continued, his voice measured. "And now, with their former rituals thwarted, they intend something even worse. To remake you, not as a bride to be claimed, but as a weapon. An heir, yes, but an heir to darkness." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Amelia spoke, her voice low but steady. "How?" Holmes hesitated, then drew from his pocket the letter recovered. "From the river, the one bearing the chilling words, 'The bloodline has spoken.' It is no longer enough for them to control you by ceremony," he said. "They seek to bind you through belief." I frowned. "Belief?" Holmes nodded. "They will construct a mythology around you. A saviour figure, a queen of blood and fire. They will whisper your name in the places of power, weaving legend until the lie becomes truth. And once the world believes," I said slowly, "they will rule through her." Holmes gave a curt nod. Amelia stood silent, absorbing the enormity of it. At last she spoke. "Then what must I do?" Holmes regarded her for a long moment. "You must vanish," he said, "completely. To the world you must become the bride who never was." Amelia's breath caught, but she nodded. "I will do what must be done." Holmes smiled faintly, a rare expression of respect. "Good. Then we still have a chance." The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Holmes moved with relentless precision, arranging safe passage for Amelia under an assumed name, securing forged papers, planning every detail of her disappearance. As the storm finally broke over London, we moved her quietly through the back alleys and into a waiting carriage. I rode with her, Holmes close behind in a second cab. Through the rain-blurred windows, I saw the city fade, the gaslights smearing into long streaks of gold and black. At last we reached Paddington Station, where a special train car waited. A favour owed to Holmes from an old case involving the railway directors. Amelia turned to me as we stood upon the platform. "Thank you, Dr. Watson," she said, her hand trembling slightly as it clasped mine. "And Mr. Holmes, please finish it." Holmes merely tipped his hat. "You have my word." We watched as the train pulled away, a wraith swallowed by the rain and the dark. Holmes remained motionless for a time, his eyes distant. Then he turned, and together we disappeared once more into the labyrinth of London. Back at Baker Street, the lamps burned low, the storm rattling the windows. Holmes sat before the fire, violin cradled in his hands, though he made no move to play. I poured 2 stiff brandies and set one before him. He took it absently. "She is safe?" I asked quietly. "For now," he said. "And the circle?" Holmes's mouth twisted. "They will rage. They will search. But they will not find her. Not unless they tear London stone from stone." He sipped the brandy, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. "And even then," he murmured, "they would only find ashes." I sat across from him, the brandy burning a trail of warmth down my throat. For a time we said nothing. Then I asked the question that had gnawed at me since the night on the river. "Holmes, who was the pale man?" Holmes's fingers tightened around the violin. "A cipher," he said, "a creation, the circle's shadow given flesh. Whoever he was, he no longer matters." "But the true master, the architect, still lives." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, Watson, and he is no fool. He will recede now, withdraw his hand from the game, let the dust settle." He set down the violin and rose, crossing to the window. Outside the rain fell in endless sheets, washing the streets clean. Holmes spoke without turning. "There is a price, Watson, to defeating evil without exposing it. A price we must both pay." I rose and joined him at the window. "And what price is that?" I asked. Holmes's reflection in the glass was a ghost of itself, pale, distant, worn. "To know," he said, "that it still watches us, patient, unseen, waiting for the day we are not strong enough or wise enough to stop it again." The fire crackled behind us, the clock ticking solemnly in the gloom. Outside, London slept, unaware of how narrowly it had been spared a darkness from which it might never have awakened. And in the dim reflection of the glass, I thought, only for a moment, that I saw another face behind Holmes's own. Watching, waiting. Smiling. Chapter 11. The storm passed by morning, leaving London washed clean, but no less grim beneath its veil of mist. At Baker Street, a brittle silence reigned, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. Holmes had slept, though fitfully, and now sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling beside him, his gaze distant and dark. I occupied myself with the newspaper, though the headlines, mundane affairs of politics and society, seemed utterly divorced from the gravity of what we had endured. At length Holmes spoke. "Watson, you recall the pale man's last message?" I set the paper aside. "The bloodline has spoken?" Holmes nodded. "It was not a mere threat. It was a verdict." He rose, retrieving from the mantel a slim, battered volume, his private cipher, book rarely consulted except in the direst of circumstances. Opening it, He turned to a series of symbols carefully inked along the margins. The ink the circle used, he said, was not merely a chemical signature. It was a communication device. He showed me a page, strange branching diagrams resembling family trees and mathematical proofs twisted into one. They wrote in stains, "Watson, microscopic fractures in the ink pattern, visible only under precise conditions. Messages hidden in plain sight." I stared in disbelief. And what did they say? Holmes closed the book with a snap. The bloodline will be reborn, but not through Amelia. They have planted seeds elsewhere. Factions splintered from the circle now pursue their own ends. Some seek political influence, others darker aims still. He moved to the window, staring out at the waking city. Amelia was merely the beginning. A leaden weight settled in my chest. "You mean—" Holmes nodded without turning. This was never about one girl, one ritual, one night. It is a long game, a generational design. I rose, agitated. Then we have achieved nothing. We have only delayed the inevitable. Holmes turned then, and I was struck by the quiet ferocity in his expression. "No, Watson. Delay is everything. A battle delayed is a battle survived." He crossed to the sideboard, pouring 2 glasses of brandy, and handed one to me. "We have given the world time," he said. "Time to recognize the threat before it can fully manifest." I swallowed the brandy in one burning gulp. "And if they do not," Holmes smiled, a small, sad smile, "then the circle will rise again, and others will stand where we now stand." He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "There is one more matter." I looked up sharply. "A letter arrived this morning," he said. "No signature, no seal." He produced a thin envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Have won the first game, Mr. Holmes. But you play against masters who have never lost. Watch the child. Watch yourself. We are everywhere." I felt the blood drain from my face. Holmes accepted the paper back, folding it neatly and placing it into the fire. As the flames consumed it, he spoke almost conversationally. "The true mastermind remains nameless, faceless. Perhaps he is many men. Perhaps he is no one." I sank heavily into my chair. "You mean we may never know?" Holmes smiled grimly. "Knowledge is not victory, Watson. Survival is." He turned back to the window. The London skyline blurred beyond the rain-streaked glass. "Nicht as long as we live to see their shadows," he said softly. "We may yet deny them their prize." A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a telegram. Holmes took it, opened it, and smiled faintly. "It seems," he said, "that Inspector Lestrade has requested our presence at Scotland Yard. A body was found this morning. Ritual markings. No identification." He glanced at me over his shoulder. "The circle devours its own, it would seem." I stood, my limbs heavy. Another lead. Holmes shrugged into his coat. "Or another dead end. Only the chase will tell." We left Baker Street as the first rays of a weak sun broke through the mist. casting long skeletal shadows across the pavement. And as we rode toward Scotland Yard, I could not help but feel, deep in my bones, that we had stepped not out of a nightmare, but into a deeper, subtler one. A game without end, a war without banners, a darkness that learned, adapted, and waited. And somewhere, unseen, untouched, a master smiled. Chapter 12. The final journey to Scotland Yard was made in utter silence, the weight of the preceding days hanging heavily between Holmes and me. Each passing street seemed to grow darker, the mist thicker, as if the city itself was retreating into the shadows, drawing us closer to the final confrontation. I had almost begun to wonder whether it was the fog that blurred my mind, or the fact that I had grown so deeply ensnared in the mystery that I no longer knew where truth ended and deception began. What had begun as a series of enigmatic deaths, whispered threats, and cryptic symbols had unravelled into a sprawling, labyrinthine conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond a mere criminal syndicate. Holmes, of course, had been prepared for this from the beginning. His mind, always a step ahead, had pieced together more than I had dared imagine, and yet even he seemed unsettled now. The world felt strangely unmoored, as if we had slipped out of reality and into something darker, deeper. Arriving at the yard, we made our way directly to the morgue. Lestrade met us there, his face pale and taut. "Holmes," he said, shaking his head, "you were right. It's them again. Another victim. Same markings." We entered the dimly lit room where the body lay. The victim was a man, dressed in nondescript but expensive clothing, his hands bound in a way that suggested ritual sacrifice rather than a simple murder. The skin around his wrists had been burned, a fresh wound. Holmes's eyes flicked quickly over the body, missing nothing. Then, with an almost imperceptible motion, he turned the body slightly, exposing the back of the neck. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. A single word was etched there, a symbol I had seen only once before, on the ring of the pale man, the closed eye. Holmes turned back to Lestrade, his voice quiet. "This was no ordinary murder, Inspector. This man was part of something much larger, something that even now we cannot fully comprehend." Lestrade's brow furrowed in confusion. "But we've dismantled the circle, the crypt, the woman, the pale man. It's all been disrupted. How could this happen?" Holmes smiled, but it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "It hasn't been disrupted, Lestrade," he said softly. "It has only changed." I looked between the two of them, bewildered. Holmes stepped closer to the body, his gaze unwavering. Circle is not a group, Watson. It is an idea, an ideology. It can be destroyed physically, but it will always return." He moved toward the door and paused, looking back at us. "I think it's time we speak to the true architect of all this. We found him, as Holmes had predicted, waiting for us." At first, there was nothing in the man's appearance that seemed remarkable. He was tall, of average build, and dressed in a plain black coat that blended with the night. He stood on the other side of a well-lit alleyway, almost as if he were waiting for us to come to him. The only thing that set him apart from the hundreds of others on the streets was the calmness in his posture, the deliberate stillness of someone accustomed to remaining unnoticed. Holmes stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're the one who's been watching us," he said, his voice low but certain. The man's lips curled into a slight enigmatic smile. "You misunderstand," he replied softly, almost gently. "I've been watching you, Mr. Holmes, but you've been watching me as well." Holmes tilted his head, studying the man with renewed intensity. "I've seen you before," Holmes said, his voice cold. "The pale man, the ritual marks, the symbol on the ring." The man gave a faint nod. "Yes, and now the game is nearly complete." He stepped forward, and Holmes did not flinch. "You're the master," Holmes said, the recognition dawning in his voice. "But the master of what?" The man smiled again, a smile that held no joy, only the certainty of inevitability. "The master of what you refuse to see," he said. "The circle is not merely a group, a secret society. It is a force that works its will upon the world, shaping it to its purpose. Every time you think you have uncovered it, it changes shape. Every time you think it's gone, it reappears in a new form." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And Amelia Winterbourne? A pawn," the man said flatly. "She was never meant to be the heir. She was merely the first step in a process much larger than you could imagine." "Then what of Sebastian?" I asked, the anger rising in my voice. "You used him too. You drove him to his death." The man's expression darkened for the first time. Sebastian was weak. He had a part to play, but when his time came, he failed. He thought he could outrun what he had inherited. He thought he could escape the inevitable. I took a step forward, my voice hard. "And you're the one who chooses the ones who will live and die. You're the one who decides who gets to control the world?" The man's gaze was like ice. "I do not choose, I guide." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes piercing. "And what happens when someone stops following your guidance?" The man's smile flickered. "Then they become the game." For a moment, the world stood still. Holmes's voice was quiet but lethal. "I'll stop your game." The man's smile vanished. "You cannot stop it, Holmes," he said softly. "Game was never about winning or losing. It is about the inevitable movement of time. Everything is a cycle, a new bloodline, a new sacrifice, a new step toward what comes next." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm part of this game too?" "I know you are," the man said, his voice calm but heavy with certainty. In that moment, Holmes did not speak again. His silence was a heavy one, pressing down on us both. For a moment, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. It felt as though the very streets around us were closing in, as if the fog itself had come alive and was pressing us into the ground. I looked at Holmes, and for the first time I saw it in his eyes. that deep, unsettling realization that he was not so far removed from this world of shadows as he had once believed. "We are all part of the game," Holmes said softly, his voice betraying no emotion but the weight of something far deeper. The man smiled once more, but it was a smile of finality. "And when you wake, you will know that you too are merely another pawn on the board." And with that, he turned and vanished into the mist, leaving only the lingering echo of his words behind. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the city around me strangely quiet. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low and measured. "It is over, Watson, but I fear the war is far from won." I stared at him, the cold realization sinking in. "I've seen it before," Holmes continued softly. "This moment, the feeling that we've stopped something, only to realize that something else waits in the shadows." I looked at Holmes, his figure sharp against the fog, his silhouette a reminder of the mind that had brought us here, and the mind that would one day have to reckon with the darkness that had claimed us all. "The game never ends, Watson," Holmes said, his voice echoing softly in the night. And as we turned back to Baker Street, I understood for the first time that the final word would never come from us. The game would always play on.